Yes. Bravo, bravo, bravo. Well, I'm George McDaniel, and I'm Executive Director and President of the Drayton Hall Preservation Trust. And on behalf of all the board and the staff at Drayton Hall, I want to welcome all of you to tonight's wonderful presentation. It's just great to see this assemblage of people on a glorious springtime night. So I really appreciate so much y'all coming tonight. Just a wonderful testimony, I think, to the interest and support of history. So glad that you're here. We have, I think, a very good program in store for you tonight. Our speaker is Dr. Libby O'Connell, who's a historian and chief historian for the History Channel. And this program is part of Drayton Hall's distinguished speakers series. I think some of you may have come to the program we had last month, and we were very pleased with the turnout for that. We had descendants speaking, and that was just such an honor to hear from the descendants of Drayton Hall. And there's some descendants who are here, and even though if you didn't speak last month, I would like for you to stand and be recognized. All the wonderful descendants of Drayton Hall. Will you please stand? I have you here. And this is the second of that series. And the Friends of Drayton Hall and our valued donors make this type of program possible. And I want to thank all the current friends of Drayton Hall and donors for their wonderful support. And I also want to strongly encourage our guests to join us as friends of Drayton Hall and be part of this exciting journey. It's really important that all of us step up and support historic preservation, history education, and we're doing that kind of work at Drayton Hall. We really appreciate you and need your support. In addition to our wonderful friends and donors, I want to extend my appreciation to the Francis Marion Hotel, which is underwriting this 2015 series with accommodations for our panel speakers and also for the reception that we're enjoying tonight. And by extension, I want to extend special thanks to Steve Dock, who's a member of our board, his wife Wendy, for facilitating this sponsorship. It's now time for me to ask all of you to please silence your cell phones and landlines, so please fall asleep. The men's restroom is on the bottom floor, and on the first floor, one level down. The ladies' restroom is located on the landing between the first and the second floors. It's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight a friend of mine and a wonderful historian, Libby O'Connell. She's an award-winning producer, preservationist, and cultural historian. She serves as the chief historian for history and senior vice president of corporate social responsibility for the A&E network, overseeing corporate and educational outreach for those networks, including History, A&E, H2, and FYI. She's also the executive producer of on-site films for organizations such as the Smithsonian, Ellis Island, and Gettysburg. She received her MA and PhD in American History from the University of Virginia after graduating from Tufts University, magna cum laude. She serves on the board of a number of organizations, and I think what really sets her apart is that her steadfast support for historic preservation and history education, and she's done that just not by words but by her actions. And she now serves on the board of Monticello, the Smithsonian Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage and National History Day. She's also has a strong affinity for Drayton Hall because it was thanks to Libby that we received support from the History Channel for the DVD interactive tour that we did of the landscape. And just to be specific, but it was thanks to the support, in-kind services that was valued at $250,000. And the History Channel stepped up to make that possible. That videotape is over entitled American Plate, A Culinary History in 100 Bites. And it examines history from the perspective of food tradition. And it's a wonderful way to look at history. And in her presentation tonight, she was going to draw from this book and examine the interrelationships between early American cuisine, foodways, and those of Charleston, and specifically of Drayton Hall. And to illustrate her presentation, she's going to use historical recipes and images from around the country, and also materials from Drayton Hall. In her book, she talks about history, and there's so many interesting ways to look at history. I mean, material culture, architecture, documents, oral history, and so forth. But you can also look at food. Historians are looking at history from different points of view, using different sources. That's what's exciting about history today. And in her book, she talks about the past and quotes from another writer who said, quote, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." She paraphrases that to say that the past is a foreign country. The foods taste differently there. So foods do taste differently there, but also those foodways continue to things that we enjoy today. So it's that connection to the past that Libby is going to present us, make a presentation today. So Libby will come.
I'm going to give my George presentation back to him. So I'm going to start now and say thank you, first of all, to Drayton Hall and George McGinnis for inviting me to speak here this evening. It's an honor to be part of the Distinguished Speakers Program. I'd also like to thank the wonderful and energetic staff at Drayton Hall for their guidance and generosity in sharing some of the images that you'll see here tonight. And I'd like to thank all of you for turning out right here on this March evening. What a big crowd. Thank you so much for your interest. The American Plate, my book, was published by Source Books in November. So it's only about 5 months old. And I feel like it's brand new. I feel like I'm still sort of presenting as a child. My book looks at 600 years of American history, from 1400 to today, through the lens of food and a few drinks. It starts with American Indians, before the arrival of the European explorers, and travels to our modern notions of superfoods and the dilemma of genetic modifications of foods. Every food tells a story of its origins, of migrations, of technological change, or cultural development. History. History is change over time. And food provides an intriguing window through which we can examine sometimes slow, sometimes dramatically fast, but definitely inexorable changes to how we live and how we ate. When you go to a foreign country, and I know many of you travel widely, you visit the museums, the city streets, the marketplaces to learn about the culture. And you try the food as a way of learning also. Well, as George pointed out, the past is another country with flavors and stories of its own, and the American Plate can take you there. Tonight, I'm going to lead you on a quick tour, first stopping in the colonial period and introducing some home information about adult beverages in early America. I noticed there was interest in adult beverages out there, so I thought I'll highlight. I'll turn this off. But, Sarah? Yeah, go ahead. Here. Okay, I'm really loud, so I hope you can all hear me. Okay, great. I'm sorry. I'll highlight the foodways and presentation that we can learn from this spectacular site you have right here outside of Charleston, known as Drayton Hall.
Can you hear back there okay?
Yeah.
Fine, good, good.
People who know me well know I'm really loud, so I'm not surprised you can hear me. And you'll notice that I read a lot from my notes, and that's also because not only am I loud, but I talk a lot. So it's a good idea to keep me on topic by me following my notes. So we're going to fly over the 20th century and then end up with a very modern story about chili con carne at the very end. And then we'll have time for questions. So think about what you'd like to ask me as I go along. Many people want to know what inspired me to write this book. And here's a slide of where I first learned about food history and heritage foodways. It's a living history on Cape Cod called Plymouth Plantation, which reenacts the daily life of the settlement 7 years after the arrival of the Mayflower, so 1627. I dressed like an early colonist. I cooked stews and soups and baked bread in an open hearth setting. I tended the herbs. I even milked cows and a goat in breeds that were similar to what they had 400 years ago. And it was here that I realized that even people who don't consider themselves history buffs get in. And you know, we all know those people, you go to an historic site with them and you're really interested and they're kind of like, when's lunch? Right? When's lunch? Well, if you talk to about food and the history of food, you've got their interest. And one of my jobs is I'm a public historian. So I want to reach the public and tell them the stories of history, and food helps me reach a wider audience. One of the things I emphasize in the American Plate is the multicultural impact on our food. For most of my life, my understanding of early American history was rooted in Massachusetts and Virginia. What I've been missing, you know, a lot, right? But Massachusetts and Virginia were home to the first English settlements, and that's where textbooks often start. But in the American Plate, I recognize the influential role of Spain in so much of what is the United States. So newsflash, Mexican food is not new in America. It's been here a lot longer than roast beef or apple pie. Remember, the Spanish were here 100 years before the English, and they are the ones who introduced domestic animals like horses, sheep, cows, goats, and chickens. So none of those animals were here, and hogs as well. None of those animals were here in what we call the continental United States before the arrival of the Spanish. And it's the Spanish who brought these foods back to Europe and brought New World foods back to Europe and to Africa as well. Foods like tomatoes, chocolate, avocados, potatoes, turkeys, and many kinds of beans. This is a great food and seed exchange at the very end of the 15th century, started by the Spanish and specifically by Christopher Columbus. He knew what he was doing. This wasn't some naive guy going, oh, we'll just sort of trade some food. He was a change agent. Never underestimate the role of a committed change agent in world affairs. People like Genghis Khan, or Elizabeth I, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or Christopher Columbus, who had an enormous impact on the natural environment in the New World. Imagine introducing all those grazing animals, and they hadn't been here before. Not to mention diet and nutrition globally. So we know that food travels widely and takes up residence in different countries and seems like it has always belonged there. Imagine Italy without tomato sauce. But of course, tomatoes originated in Mexico, not Italy. And when we say that someone or something is as American as apple pie, do we really know what that means? Because not one ingredient actually originates in the continental United States. Not one ingredient of apple pie. Not the pastry, which, you know, flour and iron flour and butter. Neither of those things were here. And wheat flour wasn't here. Not the spices, largely from Southeast Asia, but some of them from, one of them, allspice, which we'll talk about later, was from Jamaica. Not the sugar and not the apples. They came from all over the world. And you could actually give a 45-minute talk about what goes into an apple pie. I'm not going to do that. But I did want to bring it up because since Americans come from all over the world, from different parts of the world, maybe apple pie is the perfect metaphor to describe our culture. And you know, I'm from New York, we talk about the melting pot. You know, I'm going to change this. I think our conversation when we talk about people coming together in our American culture, we should be talking about the apple pie, because it's a lot nicer to be an apple pie than a melting pot. Another thing that is important to remember about early American food culture is the Native American Indian contribution to the American plate. The settlers first arrived, the Spanish first, of course, then the English, or in New York, the Dutch. The most immediate dietary change is the adoption of maize on a daily basis. Not that the colonists fell instantly in love with corn. Many of them didn't like it at first, but the Indians' generosity in sharing their corn meant the difference between life or death in many settlements. Corn is easier to grow than wheat. It still takes a lot of work, but it's not as hard as wheat is to grow. And wheat is more demanding about soil and about climate. And what you'll hear tonight is the role that climate plays in what areas, how regional food develops. But corn can fit into all those different regions. The indigenous tribes taught the Europeans how to cultivate maize, beans, and squash together using what anthropologists today call milpa agriculture. And for those of you who have ever had a fifth grader, you may have helped them do the little Indian village. I know we have to do that anymore. Right? And one of the things you as a parent might learn is that the American Indians grew corn with the beans, and the beans could grow up the stalks of the corn, and then the pumpkins or other squashes were planted around it. For those of you who do any vegetable gardening, you may know that squashes and pumpkins have great big fan-like leaves, right? They take up a lot of room. Those leaves would help reduce the amount of weeds in a milpa field, in a corn and bean patch. And interestingly enough, you end up with a food. I just had it for lunch today at Coogan's Porch. Am I saying it right? And I had succotash, which is a classic Native American dish. Lima beans with corn, and maybe some smoked. The Indians, of course, didn't have bacon, but they would smoke venison or maybe some even salmon or something, put it in with the succotash for extra flavor. And the corn and the beans together make a much higher value protein than you're going to get with either vegetable alone. So these native ways of eating the foods that they raise were an interesting introduction for the settlers on what is really nourishing food. They also taught the settlers how to treat corn with lime water to make hominy. And that is a much more easily digestible source of food than just eating the hard corn that you have before you do any treating like that. The tribes here called that milpa agriculture, they called it the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash together. And I think that has such a nice sense, the three sisters, sort of demonstrates the reverence and grace with which the Native Americans talked about their agricultural process. The next slide shows, it's not such a good slide, but that is in New England what they call cornmeal mush. And it's a variation closely related to hominy breads. Porridge is the easiest way to prepare whole grains, what we would call hot cereal. And European settlers prepared pounded or ground cornmeal by soaking it and then simmering it very slowly over low heat. You know all this down here, but I'll tell you, in most parts of the north, this is like ancient food that very few people eat anymore. If you go to Charleston, you're going to have something called cheese grits when you have your shrimp, and you're going to just think it's the greatest thing ever. But let me tell you something, people in the 17th century ate it all over the eastern seaboard. Hard-working men and women at that time could be burning about 6,000 calories a day and having grits at breakfast and then again at dinner, because you usually would have 2 main meals a day and then a light supper in the evening. You need those carbohydrates to keep going. They would cook the meat and vegetables on top. It is a very nourishing meal. It was the Native Americans who taught the American settlers how to soak the corn with the wood ashes and create hominy. And hominy, by the way, is a Native American word. It comes from the Powhatan's word for maize and soap. I have to include this slide. This is more relevant to Northwestern United States history because of the fur trade. I get a lot of comments about the section in my book that I talk about beavers in, so I thought I would bring it along tonight. French, British, and Native Americans traveled into the New World wilderness as fur traders and trappers. If you were hardworking and lucky, you might make a tidy fortune in an era when raising capital meant often physical risk. So today, we talk about venture capitalists, and they venture their money, and they can risk a fortune. But back then, there were venture capitalists who just made the money, but there were also people who were adventurers, and they went out and they risked their bodies and souls to raise money, and some of them were trappers. I'm talking about the 17th century and into the 18th century. This was the very end of a climate change moment called the Little Ice Age. It was colder than it is today at the start of the warming cycle we have. But it was colder in the 16th century and 17th century than it would be in the 19th century. It was a period when people really wanted to wear furs, not just because they were a chic fashion trend, which of course they were, but also because they were cold a lot. And nothing is warmer than furs. And furs that are trapped in the wintertime is the best time to get them because that's when they're at their most luxurious, right? So the trouble with trapping in the wintertime is you're in a wilderness area, it's really cold, it's snowy, and it's very hard to get food. But the beaver is good news. If you trap a beaver and you have their pelts, you know, A, you're going to be making a fortune when you get home with that beaver, but you also know you're going to have something to eat. Because you look at that beaver tail, see how it looks like fish? Those are scales on that tail, and you hold the tail over fire and char it, and the scales kind of ripple up, and it makes it possible for you to clean the scales off, and you have a slab of fat. And that fat is considered a real delicacy in Indian villages and among the trappers. I know, everybody's going, yuck, I do not want this. But it's a good story to let you know how our values change when we don't have to eat food like that. Just be assured, if you were hungry, they call it the hunger moon. Usually it would be March, it could be February, depends on where you were. If you were given some, you would be an honored guest if you arrived in an Indian village and they gave you some roast beaver tail. And there's a new book out about the settlement of trappers and explorers out on the west coast called Astoria. It's in the bookstores right now. And they talk about the European settlers being so delighted to have roast beaver tail. So there is a recipe for how to roast beaver tail in my book, and I hope you never have to use it. In settled areas, though, it was interesting how quickly people learned to set up home with some of the flavors. This is actually a wonderful antique Dutch cookie press from 17th century New Netherlands. And actually that was found in New Amsterdam, which is now New York. And the Dutch were master bakers because they had sources of spices. The Dutch with the Dutch East India Company, they had a monopoly of the spice trade early in the 17th century. So the cookies and cakes that were made in New Amsterdam had a lot of these wonderful flavors compared to other colonies, which limited access to those spices because they were so expensive. By the beginning of the 18th century, in the 1700s, you start seeing more and more spices in food. They always wanted to have it, but finally the prices had gone down. So in the wonderful food traditions that start developing in the 1700s here, you start seeing lots of different spices being used in dishes that today we might not put cloves and mace and nutmeg and allspice into savory dishes. We'd save those for a holiday baking, pumpkin pie, apple pie, maybe even mince pie might be right. Oh, I want to mention cookies because, these cookie press, because, you know, all over the world, any of the British colonies call a sweet, crispy food a biscuit. You can be in Australia, you can be in Hong Kong, you can be in Ireland, and they call it a biscuit. But here, we call it a what? What do we call it? A cookie. And that is a Dutch word. And one of the wonderful ways to explore who gave us what is by learning the origins of some of the food, the origins of the words, the names of what we call different foods. And so when we say cookie, it reminds us the Dutch had a powerful presence in New York for a lot of the 1600s. So now we're going to turn to alcoholic beverages. And a question has arisen. Somebody asked me, just how much did early American settlers drink? And the answer is a lot. They drank a lot. First people, the First Nations here, Native Americans, didn't drink strong alcoholic beverages. It was not part of their culture before the arrival of the Europeans. And they didn't have the technology to distill spirits. But the English settlers came from a tavern culture where beer accompanied most meals for young and old and in between. The Spaniards enjoyed beer, but were primarily wine drinkers, and the friars were quick to plant productive vineyards at their missions. But they had the right climate, right? The climate in California, in New Spain, was great for grape growing. It was a lot harder to grow grapes along the eastern seaboard. I know lots of people tried, and it didn't work, and neither did olives, by the way. The Pilgrim Fathers on Cape Cod complained about the lack of beer on their arrival. You've got to love these people. They get here, you know, and there's lobster everywhere on the beaches, right? And they write home and they go, oh, we have to eat lobster every day, and there's no beer. What were you expecting, people? I mean, the fact that you have lobster, be happy. But they figured out that if they cut up the lobster and they put it in the eel traps, they could eat eel, so they were happy. So, I mean, I actually think that's a great story. It helps you understand, once again, how differently people viewed food, and what was a delicacy, and what was something that you would just sort of give to your face. The Pilgrim pigs ate a lot of lobster. But the problem with beer is that it isn't so easy to brew beer in America because of a wild yeast, and the British recipe for beer was much more prone to attracting this type of spoilage. And it was a challenge. So the colonists often drank hard cider and a pear cider that they called perry up and down the eastern seaboard. When Johnny Appleseed is traveling, there actually was a Johnny Appleseed, his name was Jonathan Chapman, when he was traveling through America with apple seeds and little tiny, slips, we would call them, to start orchards. He grew what the early settlers planted, which were apples that were hard, and they were good for cider making, and they were good for drying, preserving, and they stored well. They weren't planting soft, lovely Bartlett pears, that are so sweet at the end of the summer, or Macintosh apples, or Honeycrisp apples that you just like to eat out of hand. They were planting those very hard fruits because they made better cider, and they kept better. And the preservation of food is a whole other study, how people preserve food before the days of refrigeration. They worked hard at it. It was an important part of food supply. The Americans also drank hard liquor, and they drank almost double per capita what we drink today. So think about, when you're walking in Charleston in some festival, you see all those people drinking, over-drinking, multiply that by 2, and that's what was going on here. A friend of mine said that you shouldn't make so much fun of them. They did not have aspirin. Imagine waking up someday and your foot is really, my feet hurt sometimes, and I'll take a couple of Advil. But they didn't have that option, so maybe a shot of rum was what it took. Rum was the most popular distilled spirit around 1700. In 1775, Americans drank 4 gallons of rum a head a year. That's a lot. This rise of rum, most of it produced in New England, was tied directly to the availability of molasses, shipped from the Caribbean sugar islands, where sugar was creating fortunes for a few European and British families. And the rise of sugar in the New World was directly linked to to the rise of African slavery. The sugar planters made so much money on this cash crop that they actually imported food for their enslaved workers rather than farm land in the West Indies to feed them. So by the 18th century, American planters and farmers were part of this north-south trade along the eastern coast, shipping barrels full of what became, by the end of the shipping, low-quality food to the sugar islands, and growing very prosperous in the process. You may know that one of Charleston's major exports at this early time in its history was beef and pork packed for the sugar islands that were owned by the British, and some smuggling was going on to 2 islands that were owned by the French as well. And we'll talk a little bit about the Draytons of Drayton Hall and the fact that they actually had big lands outside of this immediate area where they raised cattle for this export trade. As time went on, rum would stay popular in New England and along the coastal cities, while the arrival of the Scots-Irish just before the American Revolution made whiskey a new favorite. Bourbon, based on corn, of course, was developed in Bourbon County, Kentucky, and grew in popularity so much that this style of whiskey, bourbon, would become synonymous in some people's eyes with the American South. So that kind of image of the Southern planter, antebellum house sitting, smoking his cheroot and drinking a mint julep was because of the popularity of bourbon. George Washington served 75 gallons of whiskey to potential voters when he ran for his seat in his House of Burgesses in 1758. This eye-popping number may have been high even for the time period, but the idea of offering drinks to your voters was a tradition in Britain, and it migrated here, encouraging voter turnout, I would even say. After Washington's 2 terms, he retired back to Mount Vernon, and his Scottish farm manager took him aside and pointed out that with a distillery, he could make some more money out of his crops. Eventually, our first president became the nation's largest whiskey distributor, something that they may have forgotten to mention in your textbook. Madeira, this is a glass of Madeira at my house. I had a hard time putting it down. I've become very fond of Madeira. We're doing this research. You know, I'll tell you something. If you want to drink a lot and eat a lot, write about food and drink. Anyway, Madeira was one of the most popular alcoholic beverages among the colonial elites because it was imported from the Portuguese island of Madeira. It was more expensive than local hard ciders or beer, but it traveled enough, and it traveled very well, I meant to say. It traveled well enough to be worth the cost. Now, wealthy merchants and planters could afford to drink wine, but by the time it traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, it was unpredictable at best. So you're going to have problems with wine. Things get hot in a ship's hold if you're traveling at the wrong time of the year. Or even, it's just not predictable, and that can really spoil some very expensive wine. Madeira is a fortified wine with extra alcohol added to it, and then it's heated at its source. So it was heated in Madeira before it was bottled. And that reduced its spoilage. In fact, Madeira improves with travel. Our founding fathers and a few mothers were very fond of Madeira, from John Hancock in Boston, for those of you who remember the incident of the Liberty, which was Hancock's ship. He was caught smuggling Madeira into the Boston harbor. They were very angry at the British for that. Ben Franklin in Philadelphia was a Madeira drinker, and George Washington on the Potomac. Thomas Jefferson, whose significant liquor bill in the executive mansion included $42,000 in today's money spent on Madeira. Equally impressive, however, was wealthy planter and merchant John Drayton, born in 1715 to well-to-do parents. He steadily accumulated a fortune, land, 4 wives, and political power throughout his 65 years. He had a very well-trained, very fine eye for the better things in life. For example, in 1771, John Drayton ordered 2 pipes of Madeira to be shipped to Drayton Hall. A pipe was a container that held 95 gallons. So, writing his shippers, he ordered 190 gallons, 2 pipes, of the best Madeira for my own use. Meaning, I'm not going to sell it. I mean, we don't really know, maybe he did, but he's saying he was going to do that. For my own use, of the finest labor, silky soft and smooth upon the palate, in no ways rough. So I did some research on Madeira, and I ran across a quote from John Drayton. I thought, I can't believe how lucky I got on that one. But I love that idea. No ways rough. Rough is spelled R-U-F-F. So good for him. Who cares about spelling? I'm sure you have all had the unique pleasure of visiting Drayton Hall for yourself, where you've witnessed not only John Drayton's impact, but his son Charles' remarkably elevated taste and trained eye for design. This spectacular house is more than the purest example of Palladian architecture in America. It is also a structural testament to the wealth produced by the Carolina plantations. John Drayton owned over 76,000 acres from the Charleston Peninsula to acreage way west of here, large slices in Georgia, where he raised cattle and pigs for export to the Sugar Islands, which we mentioned earlier, and naval stores, which is another way of saying timber products, to sell across the Atlantic. But it would be the high-priced and really finest in the world Carolina rice and the very special indigo from here that enabled him to afford the stunning carving you see inside the house. It's just the details in Drayton Hall are so remarkable. We don't know who did this work, but an educated guess, thank you, Carter, includes classically trained master craftsmen from Europe and very talented slaves who learned the techniques from these artists. Later, John Drayton's son and heir Charles would add more details. This workmanship is world class. Of course, we all know people with lots of money who don't spend it as well as the Draytons did. I mean, you really got to say, this guy knew what he wanted, and he wanted perfection right here on the Ashley River. The Draytons were extraordinary in their pursuit of excellence. Given his love of Madeira and the art of design, it seems probable that John Drayton enjoyed fine food as well. We don't know. We don't have the records on what he served there, but we know that white planters highly valued their enslaved cooks by at least their cost, that when you're buying a slave and the slave is a cook, the price was 20% more than other workers in a prime field inn, based on early records. And some cooks were actively sought from other owners. Drayton dedicated considerable space in his Palladian mansion to, we think, the storage and preparation of food. There's a kitchen building attached to the house, but it's still not clear exactly what it was used for. On the ground floor, this is the raised basement. That was, we think, the heart of meal preparation, cooking, and food storage for the great house. This is all, I'm just trying to make sure you understand we are guessing here, but this is what's likely. Along with indigo, it was the staple crop of rice that made this lifestyle possible. I just skipped something I wanted to mention. This is the center room of the English basement, or the raised basement at Drayton Hall. Given the lack of ornamentation, we assume this area is where the enslaved workers labored below stairs. And this large fireplace, do you see the great big fireplace there? That would be room enough for several fires at once. So don't think that everything was hung over one big fire. You would pull coals and it was like having a hot burner, you'd have a lower burner, because the coals would be different temperatures. You also would have types of ovens that are tricky to explain, but take my word for it, as well as Dutch ovens. And then you could also have, in a space that big, you could have a spit where you would roast meat. I learned something at Hampton Court in England, which I always answer the questions I've had. How many of you have tried to roast a big piece of meat on a spit? It doesn't cook evenly. And what I learned was even in the 16th century, the 1500s, great cooks were cutting up the meat into lumps the same size so that everything would cook at the same time and be ready simultaneously, instead of worrying about, well, how come this section isn't cooked as well and how are we going to feed all these people? The butchering of the meat was very important to the quality of the way it was cooked. There was a spiral staircase that led upstairs. It's still there, so that would be how the kitchen staff would come and go upstairs. And along with, as I was mentioning, along with indigo, it was a staple crop of rice that made this lifestyle possible. You probably all know the story of how rice was first introduced in Carolina in the 1680s, but it wasn't until the early 1700s that skilled slaves from west coast of Africa, particularly Sierra Leone, forced across, and Madagascar. Well, the rice came from Madagascar. The first rice came from Madagascar.
Yes,
And the slaves came too because they knew how to do it.
Technology,
Yeah.
people came from Madagascar.
Well, that's good to know because I was actually focusing on Sierra Leone. But what's the most important point is what you're saying, is that it's the skills and the technology that the Africans brought here that enabled their masters to learn how to grow rice.
Actually, some free blacks came from Madagascar and settled here. So right at the very beginning, there were some free blacks here.
Well, that's good to know because I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, and I'm glad you mentioned it. Because what my most important point on this is that the technology and knowledge is coming from Africa. It wasn't something that the white players had read in a book, but they were counting on the expertise from another culture. And that's what's bringing the basis of the rice, the strength of rice, to the Low Country. Am I okay with you? Is that? The price of rice was 400% more than corn, 200% more than wheat. And that helped make Charleston into one of the richest ports in the 13 colonies, second only to Philadelphia. And it was number one in the value of the average ship's hold in the 1700s. This is an image of a dish called chicken fricassee. And that's on a 19th century plate. But fricassee is a 16th century or 17th century dish, and it was eaten regularly, or it's in lots of records in Charleston. There's a wonderful old cookbook it's a family cookbook by Harriet Pinckney Gorey. And her recipes were collected beginning in 1770. And this is one of her recipes. I made it at home. My husband was the guinea pig. It worked well. And yesterday we made it for a luncheon here where we were demonstrating 18th century meals. And chicken fricassee is made with chicken and parsley and carrots and mushrooms, but it also has some flavors that we don't normally put into our savory dishes. And that would be allspice, which is almost has a clove taste to it. It's from Jamaica. We are most apt to encounter it when you make something like chicken jerky, or you use jerk chicken or jerk pork. They use allspice in it. But one of the flavors in this dish is allspice, which was very, very popular in the 18th century. And another ingredient is Madeira. So if you want to experiment with flavors, when you go home, you want to experiment with the flavors of life in the 1770 Charleston. Put a little Madeira and allspice into your stew. Instead of using red wine, try using Madeira and a little bit of allspice. Harriet Pinckney, you know how we all as cooks, for those of you, there are some spices and herbs that you really love personally. I like thyme. I put it in a lot of different things. Harriet Pinckney, I felt, when you read some family receipts, you start to get to know what they like. She loved mace. And New York is so funny. I went to a spice shop the other day and I said, "Do you have mace?" And she said, "We don't sell that." And I thought, no, I'm not talking about No, although I think it's related. Mace is the same plant as nutmeg. And it has a wonderful smell. And she put it in almost everything she made. Whether it was cake or a stew, it would have mace, so it must have been one of her favorites, and I know it was very popular back then as well. So we're going to go, so that type of dish, I'm sorry, not the plate, because the plate is later. But chicken fricassee on a bed of rice would be something that the Draytons would serve at the house. We don't know exactly what they ate. This is the type of food that would be available. With the income from his well-managed lands and enslaved workers, Drayton could afford the type of consumer items that most American colonists could only dream of. This is a syllabub glass. Syllabub was a wonderful example of a food trend. You know how one day you woke up and everybody had sushi, you know? Or how about today? I want Kale's publicist. That's what I say. Kale's everywhere, right? So, they had food trends back then. Syllabub is an example of a food trend. And it also shows you how, it's a great example of how change took slower amount of time. So, foods come and go. Kale may not be so popular in 10 years. Syllabub was popular for about 150 years. That's a really long trend. And so, just like how you have tea sets, and it was important to have a nice tea set, so when people came over, you got your china, and you showed them that you knew how to be cool, you had tea. Syllabub came with its own accoutrements. And the first mention of this frothy drink is whipped cream with a little bit of sugar, white wine, and some lemon flavoring. And if you put in a sprig of rosemary, I think it makes it even better. The first mention of this frothy drink was around the early 1600s, so around the time of Shakespeare. It grew in popularity from the English court to the fine country houses of England, and by the 1770s, it was all the rage in the mother country. It came here, and immediately people wanted to show that they knew what was up, what was really in style. I love reading old newspapers from port cities in the colonial period because they advertise when the ships are coming in. They give you a list of what you can come down and buy from what's going to be a such and such merchant has his new things that have just arrived from England or wherever, along with luxury consumer items like scented soaps, silver needles. Needles were always being sold, Madeira, fine hats, silken textiles, and syllabub glasses for aspiring colonists to acquire and demonstrate to their neighbors that they were up-to-date members of the British Empire, not some local yokels who preferred hard cider. They're going to drink syllabub. I actually think syllabub was a hit with genteel ladies, so perhaps it might have been one of John Drayton's 4 wives who bought a set of these. These don't belong to him, by the way, but it would be the type of setting where syllabub would be served. On the other hand, it was very common, so it might have been one of his wives, but it was very common in the 18th and into the 19th centuries for gentlemen to take an interest in house design, decorations, and furnishings. So we don't really know who would have bought the syllabub glasses in people's families. The Draytons would have probably also had wine glasses, special Madeira glasses, and several punch bowls for parties, because punch was also very popular. We don't have an inventory for the family, but we do know that that's what many upper-class families had on hand. This plate is called La Famigos. It is a Chinese plate. It's a plate. It's an example of the Drayton family china. And this one was lent by a descendant, and it is just lovely. I think that for any plate to have survived through the centuries is an index of love, care, and the enormous amount of dinnerware. I mean, think about it. I know that personally I started my marriage with a lovely set of wine glasses, and we only have a couple of those left. So, but I'm mentioning this because setting a fine table was a point of pride among the English aristocracy and gentry, and the American colonists would follow suit. And well after independence they did this too, because the English set lasting styles wherever they colonized. Looking for this, there I have it. Archaeologists have found remnants of a stacking salver. It's like a glass étagère, used to display fine accessories and dainties in the dining room table. So this is not a picture of what was at Drayton Hall, but we have the archaeologists there. Sarah showed Clark is here tonight, and she's been so kind sharing these images. Thank you, Sarah. This is the type of thing that John Drayton had. And I want to point out those little glasses. Some of them may have contained jelly, like what we would call Jell-O. And I'm mentioning that because it's a great example of how people love to have reflective things on the table. Remember, this is before electric lights. All you have is candles. And if you're having a big party, you want things to sparkle. If you have clear gelatin that are colored with pretty colors, with food coloring, like you could use spinach and make a good green Jell-O. Now that doesn't sound appetizing, but it has a pretty color. Or even rose petals or different beet juice to make them shine in the light. And the candlelight would sparkle off the edges of the glasses, and it would look like stained glass. The Jell-O was made with a product called isinglass, which is derived from, oh well, it's complicated. It's from a fish, actually, but it doesn't taste fishy, but a very neutral scent. It was that taste. It was very expensive. So it was this whole combination of the glass, which is of course hard to ship, the jelly glasses, everything would reflect the light, but it also showed that you were a family of great taste, of exceptional ability to afford this type of thing. It wasn't until the late 19th century that Knox gelatin came on the market. And then a family developed, a husband and wife developed Jell-O. And they were so pleased with the product, but they couldn't sell it. They didn't know how to market it. So it was purchased by somebody else for $450, and it became a national product. I just had to bring that up because it's such a great story. And the way he marketed it, he said, America's most famous dessert. And nobody had ever heard of it. I'm sorry to go into the 19th century, late 19th century, but I just wanted to point out the type of thing that would be on the Drayton's table. Harriet Mihori is the one who kept the private collection of receipts that many of you are familiar with from 1770. She, of course, is the daughter of the capable and entrepreneurial Eliza Pinckney, who helped develop, with other people's advice, how to grow indigo profitably in the Low Country. So she was a real game changer. And Eliza Pinckney was a real game changer, and her daughter had this wonderful cookbook that I was reading. Her collection is something that's very lucky for food historians. And one of her receipts mentions making jelly with isinglass. That is the substance they were using to make jelly in this case. Sarah Rutledge will publish her Charleston cookbook in the 1840s. And she includes very daunting descriptions of how to make jelly in the 1840s as well. So we're all very thankful for Knox gelatin and Jell-O. I'm going to go back. We don't have any images of the Drayton's dinner tables, but here's a photograph of Thomas Jefferson's dining room in a newly ascertained chrome yellow. How about that for a bright color? That might take you aback in the daylight, but by candlelight, it's stunning. I think Jefferson's table would be a bit more austere than Washington's, and probably more austere than Drayton's. He has very little carving in his house compared to what you see at Drayton Hall, although it's beautiful too. I'm putting up this scene because Jefferson is a good example of someone in the 18th century who really took his responsibilities as a host very seriously. Entertaining with fine food and wines was expected of public officials and colonial leaders. The Draytons would be no exception. John Drayton was a member of the most elite Americans in his day, and he had direct ties to Parliament as well. Interestingly, his sons joined the revolutionary cause. Sometimes people with very strong ties to Britain went the loyalist way, but the Draytons were our revolutionary supporters. The decorative display of food and drink were important to these men of the Enlightenment, but so was landscaping and the planting, and quality of good food. Here is an image from Jefferson's Revolutionary Garden. Jefferson was about the same age as William Henry Drayton, John Drayton's eldest son. And I'm sure they knew each other in Philadelphia. They were there at the same time. They were both men of the Enlightenment, interested in ideas, in design, and in creating a new nation. In his famous garden at Monticello, Jefferson eagerly cultivated unusual species like eggplant and sesame plants. But eggplants weren't unusual in Charleston, and either was the sesame plant. These foods have been brought to Carolina through the slave trade, through trade with Africa. Eggplants were often called Guinea squash because people here thought it originated in Guinea, West Africa, which was the home region to so many of the low country slaves. It actually originated in India. Eggplant originates in India. You may know this, but some of you may wonder, why do we call that eggplant? And we call it eggplant because long ago, you may have seen white eggplants. Most eggplants were white, and they were shaped like goose eggs. And if you saw them out in the garden, they looked like big eggs. Things become hybridized, and so today we almost always see the dark purple because apparently that's what consumers want and expect. If you go to a farmer's market, after the carrots have been harvested, and even after the beets have been harvested, you think, wow, look at all these different varieties of carrots they have these days. They have purple carrots, they have bright orange, and they have yellow carrots. We aren't used to that type of variety in our vegetables of different colors. And they had them up until the 19th century. And in the 19th century, hybridizers believed that, oh, we should make things standard. People will want orange carrots. They sell the best. So that's what we're going to deliver. And those colors of vegetables start to disappear. And it's only now, with this revival of locally grown and organic products and heritage types of foods, that we start seeing these wonderful colors back in our diets. All right, eggplant requires a long growing season, like sesame seed, which is another key to understanding food choices and diet. Climate is a controlling factor for regional food heritage. All foods in the 17th century were local foods, except for a few spices and some special flavors that would be bought from out of the area. Why is corn found on every American table south of Canada in the 18th century? Because it has a short growing season. It's very easy to grow compared to, say, rice, which needs a long growing season, which you can get in low country. Sesame, which is the benny plant, as you know, is from the Middle East and spread from the Middle East to Africa. And from Africa, it comes to this area. Archaeologists believe it was the first oil-producing plant used for deep frying. Techniques from deep frying emigrate from Africa to the New World. British people do not produce deep fry their food. They don't have a sort, they'll fry it, but they won't immerse their food in hot oil. That tradition comes from Africa and becomes historically intertwined with the regional cooking of the South, and particularly in the Low Country. This is the area that has this wonderful style of cooking that is an amalgamation of Native American, European or British, and African. And you put it together and you have some of the tastiest food you'll ever try. The interesting thing to me about, as an outsider, I think that's fair to say, because I know you have to be born here like 4 generations ago to be from but I do know that I have a different perspective, and so much of what is wonderful about Charleston's food is food that people just call Southern. And it's not just Southern, it's from the Low Country, it's very specific. And I wanted to actually include this just to get you guys riled up in the outreach, because this is what people call gumbo. It's a one-pot stew that almost always includes okra. It's famous as being from where? New Orleans. A Creole dish, part of the great New Orleans food tradition. The first written record of gumbo is after the Civil War. It's quite late, actually. It's in the late 1870s. Gumbo derives from a Bantu word, and it actually means okra among Bantu-speaking people, the ones that are found in the central section of Africa. Okra is another African word. But remember, Africa is like Europe. Different languages, right? There are lots of languages inside Africa. The word okra comes from a language called Tree, which is the language of Ghana in West Africa. And West Africa that lumpy part of Africa that sticks out into the Atlantic, that was the source of so many, not all, but so many of the rice cultivators who were kidnapped and sold as slaves in Carolina. These people from West Africa worked in the Carolina rice fields. They worked in the growing indigo. They helped raise the cattle and the hogs. They also worked in the kitchens. They used ingredients that the settlers were unfamiliar with, but they grew to love them. The enslaved cooks from West Africa stewed okra with various meats and lima beans, maybe some tomatoes, maybe some corn, and they called it okra soup, serving it with rice. In the very civilized Charleston, Harriet Ivory wrote down a recipe for okra soup, which is almost exactly like a classic gumbo. Very, very near. It's not exactly, but it's very near a classic gumbo. And this was in 1770, over 100 years before we have records of gumbo in New Orleans. So take that, New Orleans! The first gumbo, yeah, so it's over 100 years. And the gumbo soup you'll see also in other recipes from the area. So rice is a key component in many dishes in the Low Country, and there are lots of recipes for rice dishes in cookbooks over a 300-year period. So if you really want to know what people are eating every day, you're not going to go by recipes because everyday food was often not written down. But if you want to know about what ingredient was used over and over again, look to see how many types of rice recipes were there, or how many types of corn recipes. And you'll know, wow, this was a food that was served regularly. These are the fancy ways of cooking it, because I know how to make regular grits, for example, or I know how to make rice, just regular steamed rice. But if I want to do a special dish, I need a recipe. So, rice bread, rice pudding, rice pancakes, chicken and rice, red rice. The list of rice dishes goes on and on, from Corey's recipe book to Rutledge's Carolina Housewife in 1840, to the Rice Country Cookbook in the early 1900s, to one of my favorite cookbooks, the Charleston Receipts. It was first published in 1950, and I just had such a wonderful event in my life. I got to meet Marie Cohen, who's here, and her mom was the editor of the first Charleston Receipts. I've had that book since I was 22. It's falling apart, but it still has such great recipes in it. So it's just, I'm so pleased to have met Marie. These wonderful collections share so much about local foodways, about social culture, and the rich and delicious diversity of the Charleston table. The fresh seafood from the estuary waters of Charleston, the shrimp, the oysters, the crabs, the fish, these are among the world's finest. Now, I have to be honest with you, oysters go up and down all over our coasts, and I'm from New York. We thought oysters were our first fast food because it was served right on the street, and it's been popular in port cities all over the United States. Oysters, I have to tell you, this is sort of like a fun fact, oysters are a perfect food. It's a perfect balance between protein and carbohydrate and fat. It has some fat, and it has vitamins and minerals in it. So if you want one little thing, it's like a vitamin right there in the oyster. The Native Americans enjoyed these gifts of the sea over thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans and later the Africans. They showed the new arrivals the best places to harvest seafood. And we have seen, as I mentioned, the Indians also shared their knowledge about growing maize. They soak it in the lime water to make it more nutritious, and pounding it into hominy grist. Even though corn was indigenous here, the Spanish and Portuguese introduced it to Africa, where it spread very rapidly. And in fact, one thing that happens in Africa is the arrival of corn boosts the population there, and it creates more population density in the continent. I'm not saying that corn was a factor in slavery, but it is a factor in population pressure in Africa at the time. So the African men and women who were forced to immigrate to the New World, they're already familiar with corn and corn-based foods. Cornmeal is a classic American food. We talked about that earlier. It still is eaten in New England as Indian pudding. I don't know if you've ever had that. It's actually actually really good. It's molasses baked with cream and butter and cornmeal. It is awesome. But if you use hominy grist instead of cornmeal, you top it with shrimp, it becomes a local heritage food and a specialty of the Low Country. And why is it, what's happening? Why do we have local regional foods with such strong roots long ago? It's because up until the late 1800s and the development of refrigerated train cars, you could not transport fresh seafood away from the coastline. Today, food experts applaud shrimp and grits as a classic Southern dish, but I encourage you all to claim your heritage and point out that this delicious part of the American plate came from the Charleston table. When I was first, oh, you know what, the other thing that gets adapted here very quickly, and this is another thing about climate. Red pepper, hot red pepper, takes a long growing season. You can't grow it up in Massachusetts before you have greenhouses to get an early start on things. But you can get a little cayenne in your food down here because it grows naturally here. When I was first writing my book, I had planned to end it in the year 2000. But my editor at Source Books rejected that plan. She said, no, no, no. It can't be 1400 to 2000. It has to be 1400 to today. And I said, no, I'm a historian by training. Current events, to me, are important, but they are a matter of opinion. We really don't have perspective on the age in which we are living. At least that was my argument, but I lost it. I lost the argument, I had to bring it up to today. And that meant I had to include information about 9/11. And just writing about 9/11 in New York was a very difficult task because I was there and we knew people who lost, and it was hard. It was difficult. But I had left a great American food out of the American plate, and I knew I had to include it. And that food was chili con carne. The first documented mention of chili con carne, red beans and spicy chilies and meat, comes from Texas. And it certainly is associated with the Southwest, not Mexico, but north of the Rio Grande, because it contains beef, traditionally. In the late 1840s, America's boundaries spread across the continent. For those of you who like the presidents, this was during the Polk administration. You might not like Polk, but he did spread the country from sea to shining sea, and chili came along with that. Because outfitters for the great cattle drives, as well as the wagon trains, sold these families and individuals chili bricks made of hard rectangles of dried beef, beans, suet, minced chilies, and other seasonings that could be reconstituted with water for a meal on the trail. The invention of commercially available powdered chili brought various chili recipes into adventurous home kitchens that had never seen a hot pepper before. You all have friends, maybe some of you are adventurous cooks, and you use hot pepper in different ways, but this was a really unique flavor. Then after 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where thousands of Americans ate chili con carne for the first time, people across the country began to dig into chili with gusto. Chili gave me the idea I needed to tell the story of 9/11. I went to my favorite firehouse in New York because chili fits into the needs of a firehouse kitchen. To have something simmering on the burners when the firemen are out at work, at their fires. This is a gorgeous Beaux-Arts building built around 1899 down on Great Jones Street off the Bowery. When my kids were fresh out of college, they lived nearby, and I've always noticed this building and loved the architecture. 10 firefighters for this firehouse, which is home to Engine Company 33 and Ladder Company 9, are numbered among those who were lost on that Tuesday 14 years ago, more than from any other single firehouse. You can see a bronze plaque between the doors. We all know that that plaque will never be enough. But one day last spring, thanks to an introduction, I visited the firehouse and I met Lieutenant Brian Gamoka and a team of terrific firefighters on Great Jones Street and asked them if they would share their chili recipe. I'm telling the story of America through food, I said, and I want to tell your story too. So in the epilogue of the American plate, I provide the origins of chili con carne, the history of Great Jones Street Firehouse, and the recipe that Lieutenant Gamoka gave me of their version of chili con carne. And let me tell you something, their firehouse chili is really, really hot. So now I've given you a tour of my book and a sense, I hope, of how food and foodways provide a unique window on Low Country and also on all of American history. Thank you for traveling with me to the past, a different country with flavors of its own. My website is live. You can, if you tweet, there are a bunch of people in Charleston. I'm proud to say that Charleston food bloggers are following me. Or you can follow me on Instagram. And I hope we have some questions.
Does that mean fish and chips came from Africa?
Deep fat frying was not original to England. Yes, and they also deep fat frying also came from the Middle East as well. But that they fried food, and they might batter just the way you can pan fry chicken, but not with a deep layer of oil, but in butter. But they didn't do the immersive fat frying the way they do now with fish and chips.
So that came from?
Yes, well, first of all, potatoes came from here, right? They didn't have those. Irish potatoes are not from Ireland. Irish potatoes are from here. All potatoes. Yep, they're from the New World. The New World, yeah, you're absolutely right. And actually what happens is they are introduced by the Spanish over in Europe. They travel to Asia and Africa, potatoes, and they are reintroduced by people who are coming here later on. So in the 1600s, there were not potatoes being eaten in the East Coast. They had to go to Europe and then come back. And the people who brought them back here were the Irish. And so even Americans thought that potatoes were from Ireland. And it took food historians to figure out, no, just like they thought that the Italians had invented tomato sauce, but tomatoes were from Mexico. Lima beans are also, most beans that we eat are from, not all, but many beans that we eat are from the New World as well. Yes?
You talk a lot about John Drayton, but what about the women of the house? Who dictated what was going to be served? Did they have any influence on it?
I would guess that they do have an influence. We don't know what was being served. We don't, and we know that he had several wives, 4 of them, but we know that other women on plantations were working in the kitchen. They would often read recipes because generally cooks were not readers. They were illiterate, but sometimes the plantation wives would read recipes that they'd gotten from a friend. But they were other times the cooks in these kitchens were really good, and I would guess I'm just speculating based on people like we know what Martha Washington did. Martha Washington designed menus. She collected recipes. She handed down some recipes, and some of them that she handed down, she had never cooked in her life, but she knew what they were supposed to taste like. So the role of women is very important in running a plantation. And one reason why somebody like Drayton is never single for long, A, he's a very eligible guy, but also you need a spouse to make life work. And I think in general that may be still true. I know personally, my husband learned how to cook when I was writing this cookbook. I didn't have any time to feed him, and I didn't have any time to feed myself. So it was a wonderful thing, Matt. Thank you for learning how to cook. But that's a great question. And I think there's some, you look at somebody like Eliza Pinckney. She changed the economy, not just single-handedly. Other people were working on Indigo as well. And certainly John Drayton was involved in Indigo early on. But this was a big impact on the local economy. And she was left here by her, she had a sickly mother, and her dad was off, I think he was governor of Antigua, and she was doing this herself. So in some ways, there's a lot more flexibility for women in all over the Eastern Seaboard in the colonial period. The roles were not as strictly defined as you might find later. But I still think that women in the antebellum period, North and South, where roles were more strictly written about and expected, had very clever ways of working around those expectations. And when you look at some of the clothes that they wore and all of the corseting that they were doing, a lot of times they were, when they were working in the kitchen, let's say it's time to make jelly and jam. Well, everybody was working on that in the kitchen. And the mistress of the plantation would be in the kitchen, sometimes making sure that, you know, the jars were ready and everything. She's running the show. Sometimes, other times, she doesn't have that background. Other questions?
One more, just have one more.
Okay.
George, this is a question for both of you. And I just need to know the answer to this. But at Drayton Hall, when you were talking about the kitchen being underneath in the main house, George, were there two? Was there one in a flanker or not? Or was it always at the bottom?
There's an extra half. There wasn't a permanent
Yeah,
building.
the question is, where was the kitchen in Drayton Hall? There's one in the raised basement, as Libby showed, and then what about it in the two outbuildings? Years ago, we said that the outbuilding, if you're facing the house, the one on the right was the kitchen as a result of archaeological excavations. Now we're going back and looking at that evidence again, and there's a serious question about that, so we're not sure, one, whether it was an outside kitchen, and if it was, which of those buildings was located in. That's part of the research we're doing now, so we're hoping to be able to answer that question more definitively in the not so distant future as we catalog the artifact. That's a very good question. One that we talked about earlier about working with historic sites. There are always questions, and you're investigating new evidence and changing previous opinions. So it's a great question. I'm going to I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Libby for this wonderful presentation. Questions as we go along. She's got her book for sale, signed copies at the back. Also, I want to tell you that next month we'll continue this series with Brian Jordan, PhD from Yale, who's written a wonderful book, Marching Home, and it's about the effect of